We've all been told that science is the world's greatest way of knowing. But long before laboratories and particle accelerators, people across every continent were already asking the same questions about reality, consciousness, and our place in the universe. The evidence isn't quite that simple. Today we'll examine what Indigenous ways of knowing can teach us about the nature of reality, why they deserve a place in the conversation, and how they prepare us for the journey into Eastern philosophy. Physics, Consciousness and Reality, Dickie Dredd and Nigel Adams. And this is part 50 in the video series, and we're still on chapter 7, Transition to the East. And today we will have part 47, Indigenous Ways of Knowing. Before we move east, it's worth pausing to acknowledge another set of voices that rarely feature in physics textbooks, but that speak deeply to questions of reality, consciousness and connection. The perspectives of Indigenous peoples. From Australia to the Americas, from Africa to the Arctic, Indigenous traditions carry sophisticated cosmologies that have been dismissed as myth or folklore. Yet they too wrestle with the same themes we've been tracing: illusion, interconnectedness, cycles of life and the fragile sense of self. Many Indigenous philosophies emphasise relationality, that beings do not exist in isolation but are woven into networks of kinship with animals, plants, ancestors and land. The Māori thought whakapapa genealogy ties all life to common origins. In many North American traditions, all my relations expresses the same truth: nothing stands alone. This resonates with systems science and with the Buddhist and ecological views we'll meet later. A striking example comes from Australian Aboriginal traditions of the dreaming. The dreaming is not simply the past, but an ever-present layer of reality that underpins daily life. Ancestors shaped the land and continue to inhabit it, linking time, place and being in ways that defy Western categories. In a worldview where myth, geography and ontology are inseparable. In Navajo cosmology, the world is ordered through hózhó, a principle of harmony, balance and beauty. To live well is to remain in hózhó with the land and others and with oneself. Disruption, illness and misfortune are seen as imbalance, requiring ceremony and restoration rather than punishment. Another common theme is cyclical time. Rather than a linear story with a beginning and end, many Indigenous cultures describe time as recurring, spiralling, returning. This sits closer to the physicist's idea of space-time as a fabric than to the Western notion of history marching forward. Importantly, these ways of knowing are lived, not abstract. They are bound to land, ceremony and community. They are practical philosophies that grade survival, ethics and balance. Colonisation and modernity have often silenced or distorted these traditions, but they remain vital. We include this brief section not to romanticise but to recognise that the quest to understand reality has always been global. The Western scientific lens is powerful, the Eastern traditions profound, but they are not the only perspectives. Indigenous philosophies remind us that any claim to a theory of everything must reckon with many ways of knowing. There are plenty of archaeological and historical indications of complex Indigenous mystic traditions existing in all parts of Europe before the upheaval and ethnic cleansing of the Roman Empire, Christianity, endless fractional wars, the Dark Ages, and even the Enlightenment of early scientific research swept them away. Only remnants survive in folk tales and traditions, within small communities and rural areas, providing tiny glimpses of another way of thinking and being. There now follows a summary of where we are before we dive headfirst into the Eastern deep end. So perhaps the biggest lesson is that no single civilization has held a monopoly on the search for truth. In science, if science is really a journey towards understanding reality, then every culture that has wrestled honestly with existence has something to contribute. In the next video, we'll examine the fascinating history of science meeting mysticism, exploring the first great conversations between Eastern philosophy and Western scientific thought.